All right, we're back for chapter 2 of The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and I am so excited to bring this to you because it continues to bring you through this journey of understanding where mental health was limited, the understanding and awareness of mental health and what's happening in here, and not just in here but in the body, and the evolution of that through the mid 1900s onwards into where we are now, 2025. So chapter 2, it's titled Revolutions in Understanding Mind and the Brain. And so this is essentially the transition in medical approach, where medication started to come in, where like some more resolve beyond talk therapy or just us putting people in an asylum. And he starts to talk about how in the mid 1960s, he was working he was in the Harvard Medical School training, and he was in a research study that was essentially trying to figure out whether it was psychotherapy that was good or medication. And that was mostly for a lot of people that were diagnosed as schizophrenic. And he noticed how oftentimes it was just a matter of letting things run their course as opposed to really knowing how to address people in the midst of their triggers, in the midst of their outbursts and withdrawals, as he called it, irrational outbursts and withdrawals. So he had worked in the unit and in the night shift, and he shares his experience of how this is just like a lot of his observations during his time studying to be a doctor and also working in these environments. And he noticed that at night is when the patients would open up and tell him stories of being hit and assaulted or molested, oftentimes by their own parents and relatives, classmates, and neighbors. So he was very fascinated that these were things that doctors never really saw during their brief visits. They never really heard, because the patients wouldn't really open up until, he found something interesting about it being dark and late and quiet, and just the act of sharing through talking. And he was talking about how he said, they rarely mentioned stories like the ones I'd heard. However, many later studies had confirmed the relevance of those midnight confessions. We now know that more than half of the people who seek psychiatric care have been assaulted, abandoned, neglected, or even raped as children, and have witnessed violence in their families. But such experiences seem to be off the table during rounds. I was often surprised by the dispassionate way patients' symptoms were discussed and how much time was spent on trying to manage their suicidal thoughts and self-destructive behaviors, rather than on understanding the possible causes of their despair and helplessness. I was also struck by how little attention was paid to their accomplishments and aspirations, whom they cared for, loved, or hated, what motivated and engaged them, and what kept them stuck, and what made them feel at peace, the ecology of their lives. So there was less time spent on the person, right, and what he calls the ecology of their lives, and more on like, how do we just fix this thing, this outburst, this rage, this whatever manic or depressive thing. He says a few years later, as a young doctor, he worked at a Catholic hospital, and he would do physical examinations before women would receive an electroshock treatment for depression. And he was, curious, so he would look up their charts and their lives before he saw them, and then ask them questions, and that many of them would spill out with stories of their painful marriages, difficult children, and guilt over abortions. As they spoke, they visibly brightened and often thanked me effusively for listening. Some of them wondered if they still needed electroshock therapy after having gotten so much off their chest. And his whole thing was like sad because the next day when they would get that electroshock, their memory would basically be erased. In that whole conversation, they would never remember. So, and I didn't even know electroshock was a thing. It's crazy. Just the way that everything has evolved over time. So he goes on to share more stories and about just the crazy stuff that was done that he's seen happened in asylums. And what his conclusion was is if you do something to a patient that you would not do to your friends or children, consider whether you are unwittingly replicating a trauma from the patient's past. And this was, what year was this? After my year on the research ward, I resumed medical school and was a newly minted MD. And he had a teacher who taught us, he says his teacher was named, that's Eric Kendall, that's not him, what's his name? Elvin Semrad was his great teacher, he calls him. He taught us that most human suffering is related to love and loss, and that the job of therapists is to help people acknowledge, experience, and bear the reality of life with all of its pleasures and heartbreaks. The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves, he'd say, urging us to be honest with ourselves about every facet of our experience. He often said that people can never get better without knowing what they know and feeling what they feel. I remember being surprised to hear this distinguished old Harvard professor confess how comforted he was to feel his wife's bum against him as he fell asleep at night. By disclosing each simple human needs in himself, he helped us recognize how basic they were to our lives. Come here, Charlie. And then he goes on to say, failure to attend to them results in a stunted existence, no matter how lofty our thoughts and worldly accomplishments. Healing, he told us, depends on experiential knowledge. You can be fully in charge of your life only if you can acknowledge the reality of your body in all its visceral dimensions. And so this is where he starts to kind of, and he did open up about this as well in the first chapter. I knew my dog was going to bark at those people walking by, so I'm gonna bring his ass over here. Change his experience to feel safe. So this is where he starts to again invite the idea of these visceral dimensions of being in our body, and how it's the simple things like the teacher's wife's bum on his body at the end of the night, and how failure to attend to these things really does stunt our existence and kind of keeps us in this place, which is more mind than it is body, which is more not living in the present, right? It's just this function of anxiety. So, I mean, he doesn't say those words yet here, but I feel like that's exactly what I feel when I'm in that moment of just living in my brain as opposed to feeling, and I'm living in my brain as opposed to feeling in my body because I'm not feeling safe, right? I am looking for stuff. I'm keeping myself busy. I'm giving myself this sense of stress to like, and actually he goes into this now. He's moving towards why that is. So the cause of mental illness is now considered an aberration. Okay, so he talks about in 1968, the American Journal of Psychiatry had published the results of a study from the ward where I had been attending. So he was talking about schizophrenic patients, and those who received drugs alone had a better outcome. This was a study that came out, and how this kind of shifted the way that they were doing things, because the study stated that people that were schizophrenic, they received drugs, had better outcomes than those who talked 3 times a week with the best therapists in Boston. And how the cause of mental illness is now considered an aberration of the brain, a chemical imbalance. So now he's talking about in 1973, the pharmacological revolution of all these drugs, a manic depressive So he talks about how these patients who were warehoused in the backward of the old insane asylum, some of their responses were miraculous. People who had spent much of their lives locked out and locked in their own separate terrifying realities were not able to return to their families and communities. Patients mirrored in darkness and despair started to respond to beauty of human contact and the pleasures of work and play. These amazing results made us optimistic that we could finally conquer human misery. So this was so impactful that antipsychotic drugs, they went from people living in mental hospitals in the US from 500,000 in 1955 to fewer than 100,000 in 1996. That's insane, right? So of course there was a help with that. In the 1960s, scientists at the National Institute of Health had begun to develop techniques for isolating and measuring hormones and neurotransmitters in the blood and brain. So this whole shift of understanding the way that the brain worked, hormones, the way that neurotransmitters worked, they were able to study these things over time and just see how these things were helping certain people with their mental health. Now that scientists were finding evidence that abnormal levels of norepinephrine were associated with depression and dopamine with schizophrenia, there was hope that we could develop drugs that target specific brain abnormalities. And of course, researchers needing for a precise and systematic way to communicate their findings, there was the DSM-3 that came out. So the DSM came out in like the 50s, I believe, but it was continually refined. But there was a what would you call this? It says the DSM-3 was appropriately modest and acknowledged that this diagnostic system was imprecise. So imprecise that it never should be used for forensic or insurance purposes. So it was flawed. You know, there was of course this whole journey was flawed basically. It was trial and error, which makes sense because the brain is so complex. He goes on to talk about inescapable shock. There was a study done on dogs that were in cages. Some were in cages, some were not. And they would be given this electric shock anytime the doors opened and they tried to escape. And the ones that were trained that anytime they exited, they would get shocked, eventually when the doors would stay open, they wouldn't even try to get out because they were afraid of the shock, right? They were so used to the shock. So even when they were able to flee, when the doors were open indefinitely, they had to be dragged out. And eventually, it says the mere opportunity to escape does not necessarily make traumatized animals or people take the road to freedom. And he's talking about how with people, even though they're not dogs, right? He thought about his traumatized human patients who they had no way to escape during the harm, and almost all had in some way been trapped or immobilized, unable to take action to stave off the inevitable. Their fight or flight responses were thwarted, and the result was either extreme agitation or collapse. So even though people are able to, as adults, be free of this trauma or of this pain, why is it that they still stay around it or seem to find it, attract it into their lives? And how these dogs secreted much more larger amounts of stress hormone than was normal. So he talks about in PTSD patients, however, the stress hormone system fails at this balancing act. There's supposed to be a balancing act in our fight and flies and freeze signals, and how when the danger is over, as in the case of the dogs, they do not return to normal, and it makes us more agitated and panicked and wreaks more havoc on our health in the long run. And that for the dogs, even when the doors were repeatedly opened were opened, they would have to be dragged out of their cages so that they could physically experience experienced how they could get away. This is also really fascinating. I wondered if we also could help my patients with their fundamental orientation, that there was nothing they could do to defend themselves. Did my patients also need to have physical experiences to restore a visceral sense of control? What if they could be taught to physically move to escape a potentially threatening situation that was similar to the trauma in which they had been trapped and immobilized? As I will discuss in the treatment part 5 of this book, that was one of the conclusions I eventually reached. And scared animals returned home regardless of whether home is safe or frightening. Patients with abusive families who kept going back to get hurt again are traumatized people condemned to seek refuge in what is familiar. And of course, in my head, I'm like, of course, addicted to the pain or familiarizing ourselves. This is what home is, right? Home is pain. That's what we learn. Love is pain. And I think that it's just very fascinating to understand what he called the ecology, right? What he talked about in the first chapter of the 3 different sciences, like psychodevelopment, and being able to understand how our ecosystem affects our brain and how it changes our brain, and how we will do things that some people are just like, what are you doing? But it's, again, a misunderstanding of what has happened to the systems of our body and the systems of our brain. And for me, learning this stuff, and I really hope for you as well, learning just how the brain is working has helped me in real time to be less reactive, or at least definitely for sure be able to reflect on the reaction, so that I could then see how it's not really how I want to respond. It's more of the way that my brain has learned to respond. And through much trial and error and a lot of frustration, and this is the part that I think frustrates people the most who are trying to heal, myself included. That's how I know, because you're wanting to be someone better, you're wanting to do something different, but there's moments where you just can't, and it feels like you're stuck. And of course, over time of trying and trying and trying and trying, it's like you're moving an inch or moving a centimeter even sometimes. But you can and you will, because you have to retrain what he's calling not just the brain, but giving yourself experiences to feel safe, experiences to feel secure, experiences to feel love and supported, and what is real love and what is real support versus what is abuse and abuse. Okay, I digress. So now we're going into addicted to the trauma, the pain of pleasure, and the pleasure of pain. So many traumatized people seem to seek out experiences that most of us would be repelled by, most of us being people that have not been abused. And then patients often complain about a vague sense of emptiness and boredom when they are not angry, under duress, or involved in some dangerous activity. And I totally thought about myself, because I was what would be called a chunky seeker. Yeah, that too. But after I passed that phase of drugs, and there was a phase of just like trying to seek thrill. And even like with men, or dating people that I knew were not the greatest, but even in the sense of like experiences, like jumping out of airplanes. I did that like twice, and then like some people won't even do it once, but it was just like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. Or other adventures. It just seemed like that was what would make me feel alive. Like I wanted those experiences. And keeping myself busy and keeping myself stressed, so that I could feel, not my brain thinking, I could just feel the stress of what I was used to. Freud had a term for such traumatic reenactments: the compulsion to repeat. It's an unconscious attempt to get control over a painful situation and that they eventually could lead to mastery and resolution. So he calls these things attractors, right? What things draw us, motivate us, and make us feel alive. And that we may get hooked on recreational drugs because they right away make us feel so good. But activities like sauna bathing, marathon running, or parachute jumping, which initially cause discomfort and even terror, could ultimately become very enjoyable. And it just makes so much sense, because I could see how I've become addicted to other things like working out, even obsessive at one time in my life, where it was just like so meticulous and so measured and so routine, because of what I needed to, I suppose, feel, as opposed to using other things like drugs and alcohol and men like it was before. So it's interesting how one addiction goes into another, but could it be better for you? So he says that their conclusions were that strong emotions can block pain. This suggested that for many traumatized people, re-exposure to stress might provide a similar relief from anxiety. And that right there was just like, yeah, of course. So is this why I'd rather feel more pain, stay busy, stress myself out so that I don't have to deal with the anxieties of my brain? I've heard this also so much from people saying like, I need to keep myself busy, because if I just sit and think, then like I become depressed. When I'm with my thoughts, it's so hard. I feel so overwhelmed. And I think that that's why a lot of us, the majority of us, whether it's been what they call big T trauma or little T trauma, again, with the statistics that I quoted in the first book, in the first chapter, it's pretty high up there. Whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse or verbal abuse, abuse is abuse, and the way it changes your brain is the way it changes your brain. So it's not about blame. It's more about like understanding our brain and being able to see, this is why I do what I do. So if I keep myself busy so that I don't have to feel the anxieties or hear the voices in my brain, hear all the overwhelm of everything, because I'm keeping myself busy, then will I ever really deal with it, or am I just constantly running away from it? And I'd rather feel the pain and stress of things that I'm putting on myself, or situations that I'm putting myself in, so that I can have these same ruptures, same dramas, same problems, but at least I know what to do with those things, as opposed to healing myself out of those things, which turns everything towards me. And that is like so fascinating to me, because that is the question, right? That is what healing is. And it's so uncomfortable, because again, it's like, oh yeah, I see how I do that. And as I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh yeah, I see how I've done all this shit. And I think that that gives me words to describe what I'm feeling to myself, to others, to my partner, but most importantly to myself, right? So that I can understand myself and not feel broken. And that is why this stuff fascinates me so much. So he then goes on to talk about the possible role of serotonin in PTSD. So we're moving on again to more of these findings, and just how much medications have helped because of the findings, because of the studies of like serotonin, for example, on the brain. And Prozac came out in 1988, and how great it helped. Like it really did help so many people. There was clients that he was seeing, one woman who was depressed, and now she's canceling the appointment with him the next week within a few days, and she's telling him how she's trying to have some good memories with her kids together. She's just more present. And he goes on to share a few of these people who seemingly they slept more soundly, they had more control of their emotions, and were less preoccupied with the past than those who received the sugar pill. He went on to talk about a study that was talking about the Prozac and a sugar pill, and just how effective it really was. And then he goes on to talk about other related drugs like Zoloft, Celexa, Cymbalta, and Paxil, and how much they made a substantial contribution to trauma-related disorders. He does say, like, yeah, these things were great. They did really help. And he goes on to say how it gave PTSD patients a sense of perspective. That's a really hard thing to do when you're in a trigger, is have perspective, right? You're just in it and there's nothing no one else can say at that time to take you out of it. And so to have medications, I have not tried them yet. I have thought about them, and even my therapist in our last conversation, because it would be cool to have something to take off the edge sometimes. I do feel like I've done so much work where now my triggers are not as big as before, thank God. I don't react the same way I did before, thank God. But there's still moments where I'm like, yeah, I'm spending a lot of time wasted in my mind, where I just wish I could focus on these things, these big dreams and goals that I have. And so she did tell me to bring it up to my doctor in my physical at the end of this month, and I will bring it up, but I am afraid to take it because for sure this, like, I think it's like the fear of me not doing things by myself. I'm like a martyr in that way, where it's like, no, I have to do it. I can't have help. That's definitely a big part of it. Then there's the part of like, well, what will people think? Like, how could I speak on something that I didn't do myself, right? There's that. And then definitely like ego and pride, maybe just like weakness. I don't want to seem weak. A lot of that I think has a really big play on it. But then when I'm hearing the results on here, I'm like, wow, like that's pretty cool. But there's also this, I think it's like both. And what he goes on to share is like, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's like, if I were to take the drugs, that's not where you stop the line of your work. Your work is still to do your work and to not depend on those things. And so that's what he says. It's like, drugs gave doctors a great sense of efficacy and provided a tool beyond talk therapy. The drug revolution that started out with so much promise and may, in the end, then he goes into, this is the caveat, but it may have done so much promise, in the end, have done as much harm as good. Come here, Charlie. We are nice. We don't bark. Sit. And then he goes on to say, okay, the theory that mental illness is caused primarily by chemical imbalances in the brain that can be corrected by specific drugs has become broadly accepted by the media and the public, as well as by the medical profession. In many places, drugs have taken the place of therapy and enabled patients to suppress their problems without addressing the underlying issues. Antidepressants can make all the difference in the world in helping with day-to-day functioning. And if it comes to a choice between taking a sleeping pill and drinking yourself into a stupor every night to get a few hours of sleep, there's no question, right? Which is preferable. So obviously, like, time and place, of course. Okay, go back. Go. But he's saying that it has, the downside is they may deflect attention from dealing with the underlying issues. The brain disease model takes control over people's fate out of their own hands and puts doctors and insurance companies in charge of fixing their problems. And then this is where I was just mind blown again with the statistics. The number of people treated for depression has tripled, because he's saying, if this was all working, then why are the statistics, why is it getting worse? Why are people getting worse? Why are more people being depressed? Why are all these things happen? It says, the number of people being treated for depression has tripled over the past 2 decades, and 1 in 10 Americans now is taking antidepressants. 1 in 10. The new generation of antipsychotics such as Abilify, Risperdal, Zyprexa, and Seroquel are the top-selling drugs in the U.S. In 2012, the public spent $1,526,228,000 on Abilify alone. More than any other medication. Number 3 was Cymbalta, an antidepressant that sold well over $1 billion worth of pills, even though it has never been shown to be superior to older antidepressants like Prozac, for which much cheaper generics are available. Medicaid, people on Medicaid, the government health program for the poor, spends more on antipsychotics than any other class of drugs. that's a problem, right? Like, these things are obvious. In 2008, the most recent year for which complete data are available, it funded $3.6 billion for antipsychotic medications, up to $1.65 billion in 1999. That's double from 1999 to 2008, from 1.65 billion, which I never even heard of billion in the 90s, to 3.6 billion in 2008. Not even 10 years later, the number of people under the age of 20 receiving Medicaid-funded prescriptions for antipsychotic drugs tripled between 1998 and 2008. On November 4th, 2013, Johnson & Johnson agreed to pay more than $2.2 billion in criminal and civil fines to settle accusations that it had improperly promoted the antipsychotic drug Risperdal for older adults, children, and people with developmental disabilities. But nobody is holding the doctors who prescribe them accountable. So, yeah, there's just more stats. 500,000 children in the U.S. currently take antipsychotic drugs. 500,000 children take antipsychotic drugs. Children from low-income families are 4 times as likely as privately insured children to receive antipsychotic drugs. These medications often are used to make abused and neglected children more tractable. In 2008, 19,045 children aged 5 and under were prescribed antipsychotics through Medicaid. One study based on Medicaid data in 13 states found that 12.4% of children in foster care receive antipsychotics, compared with 1.4% of Medicaid eligible children. So those are stats that are obviously shocking. And again, why? And again, why would I need a drug? So if I didn't have that whole freaking messed up thing in my brain that says I need to be strong and I can't look weak and I can't let people know what I went through, that was like a big thing, right? Like, just be tough, get over it. If I didn't have that, I probably would have wanted to have gotten on medications a lot sooner. I honestly didn't know about medications either. Like, I didn't know much about anything about mental health. But my whole point is, the people that are getting on these things are trying to feel better about things that they can't deal with, right, on their own. And that is the problem. That is the issue, is like, how are these things increasing if this was supposed to work? It's not, right? So mainstream medicine is firmly committed to a better life through chemistry, and the fact that we can actually change our own physiology and inner equilibrium by means other than drugs is rarely considered. Now it's just like, okay, let's just give him a drug, And so that's what he's going into now. It's like, at this point, the brain disease model, it overlooks 4 fundamental truths. This is how he ends the chapter. One of them is that our capacity to destroy one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. Restoring relationships and community is central to restoring our well-being. Number 1, right? We need each other. We need to restore our relationships, and that will help to restore our well-being, how we treat each other. Number 2, language gives us the power to change ourselves and others by communicating our experiences, helping us to define what we know, and finding a common sense of meaning. Me talking about this to you makes me feel a sense of like, right? Me sharing my story has given me a voice and helped me to connect with so many other people who have also experienced things. Me sharing these things has helped and given people a voice to share back, and even maybe a safe space in those moments to like DM me and message me and share, these things happen to me too, right? Conversations with each other makes us feel less crazy, less alone, less broken, more understood, because we realize, wow, I'm not alone. And then number 3, we have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including some of the so-called involuntary functions of the body and brain, through such basic activities as breathing, moving, and touching. So how can we start to live and change these visceral things in the body, feelings, emotions, experiences, so that we can heal? So essentially, how can we do these things? Like, well, he's talking about easy things such as breathing, moving, and touching. Working out for me has been imperative. Learning how to meditate and breathe has helped me so much. Like learning how to breathe in different ways has helped me to feel different experiences in my body, like safe and loved and just secure and confident and whole and vibrant and radiant. And even to see like certain things like, oh, future goals or experiences, or having what I call downloads and ideas, right? How could we do these things? By learning from each other, by sharing our experiences, by seeking teachers and mentors or other people who have also lived experience and are doing these as a way of they're doing it themselves. How could we share that with each other so that we could have these different experiences? And then number 3, and heal, right? Regulate our own physiology. And then number 4, we can change social conditions to create environments in which children and adults can feel safe and where they can thrive. That's our work. It's our work. It's our work as adults to heal the things that were done to us, to take accountability for our own lives, and to then create spaces not only for ourselves, but for each other and our children, the next gen, so that we can thrive, right? That's amen. Shit. When we ignore these quintessential dimensions of humanity, we deprive people of ways to heal from trauma and restore their autonomy. So given the limitations of drugs, I started to wonder if we could find more natural ways to help people deal with their post-traumatic stress responses. And this is what I'm loving. So now we're going, chapter 3 is called Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience of Revolution. That's what I'll be going into next week. And then the good stuff, we keep going deeper and deeper. And I never even got this far the last time I listened to the audio. The stats, again, are staggering in chapter 1, hard to read. The stats in chapter 2, staggering, hard to read. Because you're just like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, we're just hurting each other. We're not even helping each other. Why? Why are these things happening? And of course, it starts with us. It starts with us. It starts with you. It starts with me. I can only do me, right? I can only change me. And so I hope by sharing this, I can inspire other people as well. Let me know below what your biggest takeaway was. Share this with someone. This series, I'm going to tie them all together in a video series so you could have one after the other. And subscribe to my channel so that you can be in touch when the other videos drop. See you soon. Bye.